Hello, everybody. It's 3:15 now, and here comes our fourth presentation this afternoon. Will be, Miss Sandra Alvarado will be giving us a talk on TRI. And Sandra, she brings over 20 years of field and research experience in chemical engineering and environmental compliance fields. She has provided on-site and off-site support for environmental compliance audits, prepared permitting applications, regulatory applicability determinations, and compliance documentation and notification for facilities in a wide variety of industries around the U.S. She specializes in permitting and compliance for a variety of industries in manufacturing sector, with a focus on PSD and NSR air permitting, NESHAP, NSPS reporting, compliance. She's also expertise includes NSR PSD in Title V, multimedia compliance audits as well, emissions inventory, greenhouse gas reporting, and third-party verification, NESHAP, NSPS regulations, EPCRA 312, 313, the Tier 2 and TRI reporting, and CA fleet management and CARB mobile source emission compliance programs, including the truck and bus rule in use off-road diesel program, LSI fleet emission portable equipment registration program, and district stationary permit program. And Sandra is a licensed PE in both Georgia and Texas. And she's also a CARB accredited mandatory reporting lead verifier, a lead verifier, and holds a degree in chemical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. So, Sandra, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let me start, by, here we go. Just a couple of quick slides for those of you guys have never heard of us. We are a multidisciplinary firm. We actually cover much more than just consulting. For those of you that may have heard of Montrose, you may have only known it as either a stack testing company or LDAR. We actually offer a lot of different services across the country. We're made up of over 100 different companies that have different specialties, including obviously environmental consulting, industrial hygiene, safety, as well as our labs, including enthalpy labs and a couple of others. So we pretty much cover the wide gamut of services as far as the environmental industry, and of course for all manner of industries depending on the region. So that's pretty much covers. Our headquarters moved recently to Little Rock, Arkansas, and we cover also Canada, Australia, and a couple of countries in Europe which are not even covered on this map. Again, just a little bit our color wheel, which shows all of our different services and everything we do. And so it's just more than obviously the analytical that we've been covering, STAC, LDAR, and the analytical services. We do a whole lot more than that. So you'll see a lot of us hanging around, all of us from the different business lines. I'm here to represent obviously permitting and compliance. Okay. So for this particular presentation, we are covering Form R or TRI, and then we're going to kind of skip over the Form A, which is an option. I'll talk a little bit about it, but really just going to cover the Form R applicability, some examples, just some quick math, and obviously the more detailed the facility, the more complex the math. So we're going to do it at a pretty high level. How many of you have completed a TRI before? Okay, so I figured it'd be about 50-50. Those who have done it have probably stuck their head way too far into some complex math. So feel free to pipe up if you have a special case study you want to talk about. I kind of feel like this is an open audience. I know it gets pretty warm in here. So if you just need to get up and yell or stretch or whatever, just to keep everybody awake, keep them on their toes, that'd be great. Okay, so a little bit about EPCRA. It started because in 1984, December of 1984, there was a malfunction at a chemical plant in India. It caused the uncontrolled release of thousands of pounds of methyl isocyanate, and that resulted in about 2,000 people either dying or being severely injured. Shortly after that, there was another incident, not quite at as big of a scale, but because of that, essentially Congress enacted EPCRA. So that industry would be required to report the storage, use, and releases of hazardous substances to the government and to tribes. And the idea was, of course, to share these 4 regulations that would cover the reporting of releases in the event of a one-time emergency event or as part of normal operations. And this way, we are informing the community of the potential hazards in the event of an emergency. The idea, of course, is to plan for those so that the emergency authorities all know what is in the area, what could be a potential spill or release, and plan for essentially emergency response. So what is the EPCRA Section 313 specifically? That's what the TRI is, and that's what we're covering. The others, like I said, are different levels of reporting, one time only, when you report something above a certain threshold or when you have an emergency release. 313 covers essentially what is part of normal operations. So Section 313 is for facilities that must complete or a form essentially for every TRI listed chemical for which they've exceeded an activity threshold. There are more than 700 chemicals and chemical categories on the list. And if a facility exceeds an activity threshold for a chemical and they're in a covered sector, which is essentially a listed NAICS code, and they have the equivalent of 10 or more full-time employees, then they must submit the TRI report. Like I said, the TRI reports must be sent to the state and federal government and or designated state or tribal authority. And again, 10 or more employees full-time, so that could be done in a combination of part-time and full-time employees. It's basically about 2,000 work hours. The stepwise process can be used to determine if and what would need to be reported for TRI. Step 1 is determining whether a facility is covered based on whether it is a federal facility, and all federal facilities, regardless of the type of operation or NAICS code that they would fall under, are covered, or if they're in a covered industry sector based on the primary NAICS code. If they're not either one of those 2 categories, then you pretty much can stop there. You're not required to report. Step 2 is if the facility is large enough based on the number of employees or hours, and that's the equivalent of 10 full-time employees or 20,000 hours, then again, reporting is not required if you don't meet that criteria. Step 3 is to look at the list of TRI chemicals and identify what chemicals might be at the facility. If there are none, then again, reporting is not required. Then for any listed chemicals found at the facility, then look at how they're used. Are they manufactured, processed, or otherwise used? And then the step after that is, of course, to start to calculate how much of those chemicals are used and in what manner. Okay, so for a definition of manufacture, that covers the more obvious one, which is intentional production for either sale or use. But it also includes coincidental production. So that's typically as a byproduct impurity of a chemical that is being used for something else. It also covers importing. And we'll get into this a little bit more, and I think on the next slide, yeah, after this. And then there's process and otherwise use. So to process, it can be an impurity that already exists in a raw material and being distributed into commerce. Processing also includes a preparation of 313 chemicals in the same physical state or chemical form as they are received. Or preparation that includes a change in physical state or chemical form. The term also applies to processing of a mixture that's contained within where that contains a Section 313 chemical, sorry. Otherwise use is essentially anything that isn't already covered under manufactured or processed. So from here, we're going to go into the activities in a little bit more detail, just to give some examples and clarify what all of those words really meant. And so manufacturing includes intentionally producing the TRI chemical because that's what your facility generally does. So if it's manufacturing the material for sale or distribution, or manufacturing it to be used on site in another process. Chemicals can also be coincidentally manufactured, in which case the chemical is not intentionally manufactured, but it's created as an impurity or byproduct. And then coincidentally manufacturing can happen at any point in the facility. That can be included in waste treatment or when combusting fuels. Importing of a TRI chemical also includes caused to be imported. What that implies is essentially if you purchase through a chemical broker or through another third party where they are importing it on your behalf, it still triggers reporting for your facility, or I guess to be considered as part of the threshold determinations. For processing activities, this is just a little bit more information about examples of processing. Processing involves distributing a TRI chemical into commerce. This can be done either as a reactant in the manufacturing of another substance, or it can be that the chemical is added to a formulation or an article component to a product, which is then distributed into commerce. Repackaging also is a possible processing activity. Under TRI, processing also includes sending a TRI chemical off-site for recycling. And finally, processing may also include the unintentional processing of a TRI chemical if it appears as an impurity and then leaves the facility in the product. So let's look a little bit more at repackaging. Any repackaging of a TRI chemical for distribution in commerce is considered processing as well. A repackaging could be from any type of container into any other type of container. So they can be similar sizes, or they could be very different, such as a pipeline into a tank, or vice versa. As long as the TRI chemical is going from one container to the other and is being distributed into commerce, that the chemical would be considered processing. Repackaging does not include taking samples from containers for the purpose of quality assurance, and it does not include simply relabeling. As long as the TRI chemical stays within the container, placing a label on the container itself would not be considered repackaging. Any repackaging without distribution into commerce would not be considered processing. For example, TRI chemicals contained in a 55-gallon drum that are placed into smaller containers and distributed in the facility to be used at the facility, but are not being distributed into commerce, would not be, count towards this threshold. The otherwise use also includes activities that are not considered, pretty much anything that's not considered manufactured or processed. Chemicals that are otherwise used include chemical processing aids like solvents, lubricants, refrigerants, or manufacturing aids like lubricants, refrigerants, or catalysts, and then ancillary activities. So that might include chemicals used to remediate wastes or to clean process equipment. Chemicals that are contained within tools such as a hydraulic fluid or other equipment at the facility would be considered otherwise used as a manufacturing aid. Some examples of manufactured, processed, or otherwise used are here. This is a covered facility that has a coal-fired boiler. Say that fast. The combustion of coal generates aerosol forms of hydrochloric acid as a byproduct. And so it's kind of cheating because the answers are on there. My plan was originally to make them appear later, but so the question is, of course, are the aerosol forms of HCl required to be reported? Yes, because the facility coincidentally manufactures the hydrochloric aerosol in aerosol form. If the quantity exceeds 25,000 pounds, then it must be reported. For the second example, it's a facility that combines toluene with other materials to form paint, which is then sold. So in this case, the facility is processing that toluene. And then in example 3, the facility cleans equipment with toluene and then separates the two components of a mixture by dissolving one component in toluene. So those are two separate processes. So the idea is to consider each one of those operations and figure out if they, and in some cases, might have two different activity thresholds. So they might be considered manufactured or processed. In this case, they are both otherwise used because they're cleaning the equipment and also using it for a different activity. In the second part, I forgot to finish reading, sorry, subsequently recovers the toluene, but that is also otherwise used. So as we covered earlier, the process of completing the TRI forms are a three-step process. In the first step, you determine which TRI chemicals you handle in your facility, and then which of these you would need to report on. For step 2, you determine which activity thresholds apply and calculate the quantities that should be evaluated against each threshold. And then step 3, which is shown on the right, is the release and waste management reporting. This is the information that essentially goes into the actual TRI forms. So what specific information are facilities required to report? For the Form R, which is the more common form, facilities are required to report on the fate of the TRI chemical. So does it go out as waste? Is it an air or water release? Is it treated or go through energy recovery, recycled, and then off-site transfers as well? So all of those kind of go into that final stage once you've already determined that you must report. Form A, which I'll cover really quickly, is not very common. Let's consider it the 1040 EZ version for tax filing. Most people don't qualify. If you do, you're really lucky. It's essentially a simplified version. And what that does is does not require that final step. You don't have to account for your waste management and releases. So really all you have to do is report on the chemical itself. Some of the criteria is that it's not a PBT, which we'll go on to in a couple of slides. It was not either manufactured, processed, or otherwise used in excess of 1 million pounds. And the total annual reportable amount, essentially, in terms of the waste management or releases, does not exceed 500 pounds. So again, not very likely for most facilities. This is just essentially the website you would go to if you're trying to file through TryMeWeb. That is part of the CDX as well. So if you've ever used CDX before, you'd use the same account information. In Texas, if you report emissions as part of your TRI, you also must match those emissions with the annual waste summary and the emissions inventory report. It also, if you didn't already trigger, would require you to report as far as pollution prevention and have a pollution prevention plan. So that does involve some additional reporting if you haven't already triggered it for one reason or another. So the non-PBT and thresholds, and again, we'll define some of these acronyms that EPA loves, but so commonly known, is essentially whether you are meeting the criteria for manufactured, then you must report if you manufactured more than 25,000 pounds. For processed, it's again 25,000 pounds, but if it's otherwise used, then it's 10,000 pounds for that chemical. And so as I mentioned before, if a chemical is both manufactured and otherwise used, you would evaluate it against the activity threshold that applies for that activity. So the listed PBT, this is where we go a little bit more into the detail. So PBT is a persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemical. I can't say that all at once. So otherwise known as PBT is much easier. And there are a subset of chemicals on the list. PBT chemicals have lower activity thresholds because they're of special concern. And they have some special rules when reporting. There are 16 chemicals and 5 chemical categories that are defined as PBTs and TRI. So this is an example. This does not cover all 21, but here's kind of a grouping of each and the different thresholds that would apply. You've got 100 pounds, 10 pounds, and 0.1 grams per year for dioxin-like compounds. Essentially, there are some caveats in here, but once you get past the qualifiers, if you determine that you are either manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using these materials, then you'd have to evaluate them against these lower thresholds. PFAS, which was added back in 2020, also is subject to the 100-pound per year threshold, though not listed as a PBT. So the list contains over 700 chemicals and chemical categories. They are listed essentially in 4 sections: the chemicals by name, chemicals organized by CAS number, qualifiers, which we'll get into in a little bit, and then some chemical categories. The list does change fairly frequently. Almost every year, there's either an addition or some clarification issued by EPA. So it is something that you must go through every year to make sure that you're evaluating the right threshold and the right, I guess, category for whatever materials you're using. And of course, here's the website again that you can continue looking more into. So some of the qualifiers that we have, they're parenthetic qualifiers when you see them on the list. And it can be anything from how they are manufactured or processed. For example, for aluminum, the qualifier is fume or dust. This means that aluminum would only be considered under TRI in the fume or dust form. Isopropyl alcohol is also a very special example. It only needs to be considered if the chemical is manufacturing isopropyl alcohol and using a process called the strong acid process. Otherwise, it would not qualify. And then lastly, just sulfuric acid as another example, which is covered only in the acid aerosol form. So this typically happens when you have either a process tank, a bath, or a stripper or scrubber, where you would actually send it up into the water and somehow create a mist. So that's the most common way of having that kind of qualifier show up. Facilities also need to take care to identify chemicals used or generated at the facility that may fall into a category group. So chemical category groups have individual chemicals which must be considered whether there are multiple. So in this case, you're going to have the metal and different metal compounds that could be considered under the same category. There are some caveats to that, which is not to get too complicated, but if you have a metal and metal compounds that both exceed the threshold, then you only have to report it under one as the metal primary, unless there are some other caveats in here, which there are many to the right. But essentially what you have to do is consider how many of those compounds would exceed and then look at them together as one category. These are some examples of activities that are not considered towards the thresholds. That is, they're not considered manufacturing, processing, or otherwise used. So for example, storage. In itself, storage of a TRI chemical would not need to be considered towards the activity threshold. The emissions would need to be accounted for if that material, if it contains a 313 material, but the actual storage does not count towards the threshold determination. Remediation of on-site contamination would not be considered a threshold activity as long as the waste was on-site and not brought in from off-site for the purposes of waste treatment or waste management. So there are several others on here. I'm not going to read to you guys all of the bullets. You guys can get a copy of the presentation. I really don't want to bore everybody to sleep. Skip that. Okay, some exemptions. This includes, whoops, sorry, I think there we go. PRI exemptions include the de minimis exemption, the articles exemption, and the laboratory activities exemption. A number of exemptions apply only to facilities in the metal and coal mining sectors. And then there's also a series of exemptions for motor vehicle maintenance, routine janitorial, facility grounds, intake water, air. So there's several others that are basically not included part of the primary activity or production activity for the facility. Let's look at the de minimis exemption first. Under the de minimis exemption, the quantity of a non-PBT chemical in a mixture is exempt if, essentially, if it's not, to make sure I say this right, in the case of an OSHA-defined carcinogen is present at a concentration less than 0.1%. So if it's considered a carcinogen, then the 0.1 applies. Otherwise, it's the 1%. If it's less than 1% for a non-PBT, non-carcinogen, then it would be below the de minimis and would not need to be considered. The de minimis exemption cannot be used for PBT chemicals. As far as the supplier notification requirements, suppliers are not required to notify users of the presence of a TRI chemical that is below the de minimis concentration. However, the users of the mixtures containing the chemicals are still required to consider all quantities known to be present. So the exemption is the only exemption that does not apply to PBT chemicals. All of the others do. The article exemption applies to TRI chemicals contained in articles. There are 3 criteria that must be met to be considered an article. First, an article is formed into a specific shape or design during its manufacture. Second, an article has an end-use function that is dependent in part or wholly on that shape or design. And third, an article does not release a TRI chemical under normal processing or use. If a TRI chemical is released from an article during its normal use, it's very well may negate the exemption. In order to maintain the article status, the total chemical release from all articles or like items must either be in a form having a specific shape or design, or recycled directly or directly reused. And emissions must be less than or equal to 0.5 pound, or releases. If the form having a specific shape or design generally means that the releases from the article must still look like and be recognized as the article. If more than 0.5 pound of the chemical is released in the course of a year, then of course this does not apply. The exemption won't apply. So here's a few examples of how this works. Wire itself could be considered an article, but in cutting the wire to specific lengths, there's some waste of off-spec cuts and some dust. The generation of the cuts are still recognizable as pieces of wire and will not by themselves negate the status. Quantities of the dust and off-spec cuts that are not recognizable, that are greater than 0.5 pound and not recycled would negate the status. So obviously, if you've got more than the unrecognizable amount, that's more than 0.5 pound. Let's look at the example of fluorescent light bulbs. When the bulbs are no longer of use, they are crushed in an enclosed container for recycling. In this case, the fluorescent bulbs would still be exempt. The normal use of fluorescent bulbs does not release mercury. Crushing of the bulbs may release mercury, but that is not considered normal use of the bulb. So the exemption is not negated. Note that the mercury in the bulbs is exempt from TRI reporting, but other regulatory requirements associated with proper management of waste should of course be followed. So it's obviously really easy to get all of those rules and exemptions confused. So it only takes that 0.5 pound of chemical release to negate the exemption. You do need to make sure that you've adequately done your due diligence and quantified that as best as possible. Be able to make sure that you don't negate the article exemption. There's a number of different sources of information available to the facility to be able to identify the chemical concentrations and collect the data. We've talked about some of these already, such as SDSs and product specifications. Facilities should also consider any waste profiles and testing. Consider any waste leaving, raw materials entering the facility. Essentially, what you need to do is really a process flow diagram that shows in all of your input streams and all of your waste streams for each chemical, and in all of the different manners in which you're utilizing. That will help you determine what the activity thresholds will apply. Regulatory reports, either air permits, water, chemical analyses associated with those permits and applications, and waste reports are all good sources of information for your TRI chemicals. Concentration of a TRI chemical can often be obtained from the SDSs or other products technical documents. In some cases, the exact concentration is provided. If that's the case, then you'd have a concentration of, for example, 25%. That you'd be able to utilize directly for the activity threshold determination. In other cases, the SDS may provide only an upper bound. If the SDS says that there's at most 25% of a given chemical, then you would actually use 25% as the upper limit in the calculations. Oftentimes, the SDS will provide a range. In that case, if the SDS provides you a range of 30 to 50%, you'd use the midpoint, in this case, 40%. In some cases, a lower bound is provided. If a lower bound is provided, facilities would have to subtract out any other known constituents, creating an upper bound, creating your own range, and then use the midpoint of that range. So in this case, if the SDS says the product contains at least 75%, we know that there's anywhere between 75% and 100. The midpoint of that is 87.5. In some cases, it says they're at least 75%, but then provides another material, so let's just say water, 15%. So we know that the upper bound is 85%. So you take the midpoint of the 75 to 85, which in this case would be 80%. So we've got a couple of examples here. The facility otherwise uses 15,000 pounds of an industrial solvent for cleaning. The SDS provides that it contains at least 50% of tetrachloroethylene, and then also provides solvent at 20% that's non-hazardous surfactants. So this is the only tetrachloroethylene mixture at the facility, so we're only going to take this one into account when we're doing math. You subtract out that non-hazardous amount, leaving a maximum of 80%. So you determine the midpoint between the known minimum, which is 50%, and the reasonably expected maximum, which is at 80%. So that midpoint at that point becomes 65%. You multiply the weight of the solvent to get the number of pounds of that material itself, in this case, 9750. Because the total amount is otherwise used and the threshold for that is 10,000 pounds, the facility is not required to submit a report for this chemical. So the items to take into consideration here as you start looking through the release reporting is making sure that you're capturing all of these different streams. When estimating releases and waste management quantities, be sure to consider all sources and uses of the TRI chemical, not just your main feedstocks. For example, consider chemicals that are used to clean production equipment, fuels, maintenance chemicals, catalysts, and lubricants for machinery. These could all be sources of TRI chemicals. Reasonable estimates are required by law. However, the best approach is usually facility specific. The data and approach must be documented and should be consistent. And in this case, even when you determine that you don't need to report, you really need to maintain that documentation in the event of an audit. That's going to be important to show that you documented all of your assumptions and all of your supplier information. Again, some additional information to consider, what to report and how to quantify that information. What do you have in terms of stack testing measurements, direct or monitoring that might be able to give you some of that mission factors or fairly good estimates for your facility. Similarly, for discharges to water, you can look at stormwater, look at your actual process streams, what's going to on-site treatment, and anything that's going off-site to a water body or streams, any DMR or other analysis that you might have that would give you constituent information and quantities. For waste, what do you have for on-site disposal? What do you send off-site? What's recycled? Any recycled information that you might have in terms of content, what's coming back on site. Then you have obviously what's going out and anything that's being reused. So you must account for both when it's coming on site as a recycled material and when it's leaving off site. You should have that documentation, the analyses. So let's look a little closer at the actual Form R. It's comprised of two main parts. The first part is the facility specific information. It covers, it has 5 sections for reporting information about your facility, covers specifically your facility, your location, parent company, and several other details in terms of identification for your facility. The second part covers information about the chemical which you're reporting, and those are covered in 8 sections. The first 4 identify the chemical, how it's used, and the maximum on site at any time. The next 4 are what we call the meat of the reporting, and that is where the facilities report the actual quantities that were managed as waste and how they were distributed. When using the TryMeWeb application to complete the Form R, the sections of the Form R are not covered sequentially. So this allows the system to streamline some of the questions, but we'll now go through some of the information that goes into TryMeWeb. It's important for TRI filers to understand the difference between reporting a 0 and reporting an NA for not applicable. Use NA when there is no possibility that the chemical could be released or otherwise managed as waste. For example, in Section 5, facilities enter the quantity of the TRI chemical that went to their on-site landfill. If the facility does not have an on-site landfill, there's no way that the chemical could end up there, so you use NA. Facilities should use 0 when no release occurs or less than half of a pound of a non-PBT chemical is directed towards that medium. For example, if a facility has a waste stream discharged to water and has control equipment in place that completely removes the TRI chemical from the waste stream prior to discharge, they would enter a 0. Use a 0 instead of an NA because a discharge is possible. If, for example, the control equipment stops removing 100%, there's a malfunction, or for any other reason. There is a code that's considered the basis of estimate code, listed right there, several different letters and number combinations. It's required for all numerical estimates, including 0. A basis of estimate code should not be entered if you're using an NA. So some of the, I guess, trickier items that you get into with Form R are the metal versus metal compounds. There are specific circumstances under which you report the individual metal compounds versus the elemental metal. The way you consider the threshold determination, whether you could do it as a combined category grouping, and also what the fate is, of course, and how that's all reported goes into much more detail in the instructions. So if those categories apply to you, that's where we'd recommend you look at it from a facility-specific operation. A couple of really quick examples. We've got a coil coater that applies a coating to an aluminum coil. In this case, the coating contains a solvent or 2 solvents, xylene and toluene, and a pigment. In this case, which thresholds apply for each of those materials? So in this case, it's processing for the lead compounds, and lead is a PBT, so of course the 100-pound threshold applies. The chromium compounds, at the processing threshold. And that's because these materials remain with the product, so they are processed. Otherwise used are the xylene and the toluene, which are the solvents, and those do not remain with the product. And so that is the reason why they're considered otherwise used. A forest products company applies a coating to wood. The solvent is again methanol and formaldehyde. Product of reaction is acetaldehyde. So which thresholds apply? The manufactured, if it's produced in the reaction, so therefore it's manufactured. And then for the others, again, as solvent, they will not remain with the product. So methanol and formaldehyde are considered otherwise used and subject to the 10,000 pound threshold. And then lastly, a manufacturer burns coal to generate steam. The coal contains impurities, chromium, lead, mercury. And then as a product of combustion, you get the HCl and the dioxins. The fly ash contains chromium oxide. So you need to consider all of those as in terms of the threshold determinations and of course their final fates when reporting. So otherwise used are the impurities, the contaminants in any fuels. So just kind of a side note, this is for propane. We found this one to be interesting because propane itself is not listed, but one of the byproducts or impurities in propane can be propene, which is a listed component. And that's often missed because you're only looking at the propane as the main source. It's important to look at any contaminants in all fuels. And that is specific to each vendor, the purity of the material, and that needs to be really evaluated every time you're really looking at all your specific materials at your site. Again, manufactured byproducts, HCl, dioxin, and chromium compounds. And so since those are produced from combustion, those are manufactured. That is pretty much the bulk of it. Here's just some quick catch-ups. There's been a lot of movement in the last couple of years. PFAS was added for reporting year 2020, subject to manufacturing, processing, otherwise used reporting thresholds for 100 pounds, which is really low compared to most others, even though it was not listed as a PBT. 3 others were added for reporting year 2021. And then in November of 2021, EPA added all natural gas processing plants as a covered sector. So the NAICS code was added to the list of codes. That 2022 will be the first year. The report will be due July 1 of 2023. And then in December of 2021, EPA extended TRI reporting requirements for ethylene oxide facilities. Originally, they had issued a notice to all 31 facilities and said that it was a possibility. They cited concerns about harmful effects to human health and employee exposure and added 29. And in this case, EPA has the discretionary authority to extend TRI applicability based on a variety of criteria that is outside of just the listed NAICS codes and all of those. It can be anything based on chemical toxicity, proximity of a facility to other facilities with similar emissions profiles or releases, and of course, proximity to heavy population centers. So in this case, they determined that they were concerned with the harmful effects, the toxicity of ethylene oxide, and pulled in specifically the 29 facilities. So in this case, for newly subject facilities, you should already be actively gathering operating data to track the chemical activities, the releases, and the waste management quantities monthly, preferably, so that at the end of the year, it's a little easier to compile all of this information. For additional information, there's a couple of different websites you can go to. And that's about it. Kind of flew by.